Good morning and welcome to the Crocker Art Museum. My name is Houghton Kinsman and I'm the Adult Education Coordinator here at the museum. Before we begin today's program, I would like to read a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the Crocker Art Museum is on the traditional unceded land of the Seminal people, and the current state of California is the homeland of many tribes. We are honored to be here today and acknowledge our responsibility to these Native nations and our commitment to work with them as we move forward as an inclusive institution. So I want to say a big thank you all for joining us here this morning. We have a wonderful program in store for you today. Today, we take a peek behind the scenes at Todd Schorr's exhibition, Atomic Cocktail, currently on view at the Crocker, and chat with our colleagues over at the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art in Virginia Beach, who organized the exhibition. But first, a few logistics. Today's program will be recorded and emailed to members and all program registrants. Closed captions are also available, so be sure to toggle those on your toolbar if you want to use those, and make sure to open your chat frequently to prevent the captions from being obscured. Please use the chat for any comments you may have and the Q&A for any questions you have for us to answer in our conversation. Closed captioning is supported by a grant from the California Arts Council, a state agency, and the National Arts and Disability Center at the University of California, Los Angeles. We'd also like to thank sponsor Juxtapose. I would also like to personally thank Christy Hagella, who coordinated the Crocker installation of Atomic Cocktail. The exhibition is wonderful and a true testament to your professionalism and incisive thinking. I also want to thank all the members joining us here today. Your donations and support, as well as those of the general public, is especially vital at this time. These contributions and your support help make these programs possible, so thank you all. For those of you who are interested in a membership or those watching who need to renew, we'll put a link in the chat to our membership page where you can sign up, purchase a membership as a gift perhaps, and renew. Now, although the museum is closed and the Atomic Cocktail closes on the 31st of January, you can still experience it online. Christy did a wonderful Crocker talk on our YouTube page that you just have to see, so be sure to check that out. We're also throwing links into the chat now for our fancy new online store. I have my Crocker mug. Be sure to get some Crocker merch. And we also put our calendar events page where you can sign up directly for upcoming programs. Before I introduce my two guests today, Truly and Heather, we're going to share a brief walkthrough of Atomic Cocktail now, just to jog the memory. I hope you enjoy. Man, I do miss being able to visit the show in person. Let us know in the chat if you had a chance to see the exhibition or if you have any particular favorites of Todd Schorr's work. Now, on to Tale of Two Schorrs. This morning, I'm joined by two esteemed Virginia MoCA guests, curator Heather Huckemzadeh and curator of education, Trudy Matthews. Since beginning her tenure at Virginia MoCA, Heather has organized over 70 exhibitions, ranging from local to internationally recognized artists. The result is a dynamic exhibitions program that has raised MoCA's profile locally, nationally, and internationally. Some of her recent exhibitions include Inka Essenheim, A Fine Line, Rest of History, and Todd Schorr, Atomic Cocktail. She has contributed to Inka Essenheim's monograph and the catalog that accompanied the Seminal group exhibition, Turn the Page, the first 10 years of Hi-Fructose, which we'll hear about a little bit later on. As curator of education, Truly works as a member of the Education and Exhibitions Department, overseeing education staff and managing all on and off-site school programs, public programs, and interactive spaces and materials. Prior to Virginia MoCA, Truly worked at the Hermitage Museum and Gardens in Norfolk, Virginia, as Education and Visitor Services Manager. She lives in Norfolk, Virginia, and is passionate about helping people make meaningful connections between art and the everyday. Truly serves on the executive board of the Virginia Art Education Association and holds an MA in Museum Studies from Johns Hopkins University and a BA from Old Dominion University. So welcome, Heather and Truly.
Hi, Houghton. Thank you.
How are you two doing today?
Great. It's beautiful here in Virginia.
The sun shining?
Sun shining, about 65 degrees. It's like the perfect day to be outside.
How are you doing, Truly? I think you muted.
What's Zoom without a technical difficulty? I'm glad I can be the first one to start us off. I'm doing great. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Heather, you had a funny story to share when we were prepping for this. Santa may have made an appearance for her.
I live very close to a golf course. There's one a little bit behind my house. And this morning while having coffee, a helicopter landed in my backyard, beyond my backyard, and picked up Santa. It was a very surreal moment. I did take pictures so that there's proof. But it was a very odd moment. And the gentleman flying the helicopter had to remove the door of the helicopter so the Santa could actually fit inside. So it was, yeah, Christmas is here. Santa is off to visit somebody in Virginia.
Sounds like it could be a Todd Schorr painting.
Yeah. I want to thank you both for joining me today. This must be a first for the Crocker, a program at 10 a.m. on a Sunday. So thank you to all those members and audience members who have joined so early today. I have to admit, I contemplated sleeping in my suit in case I overslept. So I'm glad that happened. But in sort of doing my research for this in conversation, when I looked at the show at Virginia Mocha, I realized that it was in 2018. And for a year 2020 that felt like it has sort of stretched on seemingly endlessly, I thought we could kick off the conversation by checking in with you two and seeing if you had any funny anecdotes, memories, highlights from 2018.
Not that I can recall. It took a bit of digging through some documents, talking to Heather and some other colleagues to bring back the memories. But I was excited to visit that time. It's been a while.
Absolutely. It was a very different time. So it's hard to kind of reconcile the moment in which we were making this exhibition with the moment that we're in now.
And like sort of over the course of the exhibition, did you feel like your initial response to Todd Schorr's work changed over the course of the show?
More, if anything else, it more just deepened where I already was. Like, you know, I already had formed some, I mean, because I'm privileged enough that I had got to spend a lot of time with Todd, and I got to visit him in his studio and spend some real quality time with him. So I already had a really good idea of where I was and how I felt about his work, and having the privilege of having it in your own museum where you can literally visit every day. I know there's going to be a lot of Todd fans who are like, oh, but yes, I visit it every day. And I did visit it every day. And every time I spent time with the work, my appreciation just deepened. And anybody who has seen Todd Schorr's work in person can relate to the fact that there's details that you are not seeing, even if you visit it twice, even if you visit 3 times. Like, you just kind of can go back and just mine deeper and deeper every time you see the work.
And for you, Truly?
I wasn't as familiar with Todd's work as Heather was. I think I first got introduced to him through his being in a previous exhibition that we hosted, that we curated and hosted at Virginia Mocha. But I think I was initially struck by just how jam-packed these works of art and all the pop culture imagery and just the sheer overload and then the mastery of technique. And the more time and research and the more time that I sat with the work, I think his personal narrative really started to emerge for me, as well as his commentary on society. And those things to me weren't evident right from the jump. And the more I sat with them, the more I looked, began to think about programming and pulling out the large themes. Those are what's stuck with me to today. That's how I kind of frame my thinking when I find myself revisiting Todd's work in this exhibition.
And I'm so glad you both brought up those points, because in researching the show, I spent a lot of time sort of on the internet, in our shared drives, going through some of the curatorial stuff, and then looking at Todd's work online and reading a bit more about his work, but then also having the luxury of being able to go into the space and experience the work in person and think through it a little deeper has been a real luxury, even though the museum's closed. So I'm excited to jump in and explore the show. This is sort of a unique opportunity to explore a bi-coastal institutional collaboration that has a number of years behind it. So with that said, I'll pull up the PowerPoint and we can jump straight in. So I think I've been billing this in conversation sort of as a traveling program, for those of us who had travel plans in 2020 that didn't get to travel. And now, especially with the rainy weather, being from South Africa, sunny South Africa, I do feel like I might need to get out of Sacramento for a little bit. So I thought we could travel Virginia to the Crocker through Todd's work. And I think the best place to start is with Todd himself. So I put this image sort of first in line because I love it. It sort of gives you a sense of the scale of the painting Ape Worship, but also it puts into perspective how tall Todd is. And I was checking with you earlier, Heather, because I've never met Todd in person. We've corresponded via email. So I had to make sure that he was as tall as he seemed. But Heather, my first question is sort of to you and about Todd and his career and sort of the evolution of his interest in fine art, and if you could talk a little bit more about some of the sort of seminal moments in his career.
For sure. Todd entered college in 1972, and he did it with the intention of becoming a painter, but he was advised at the time with his style and with his interest to become an illustrator. So he did that. He graduated from the Philadelphia College of Arts, and I think it has a new name now. I think it's University of the Arts, with a degree in 1972. And in 76, he began to freelance, moved to New York City, began to freelance, had tremendous success as a freelance illustrator. He worked with George Lucas. He worked with Francis Ford Coppola. He did album covers for AC/DC. He did covers for Time magazine. So he had a tremendously successful freelance illustrative practice, but he was still also making art and making painting and trying to move that forward as well. And he was achieving some success by the 80s. He was achieving some success. And then in 1986, he was included in an exhibition in Japan. It was called, this is not a super memorable title. It was American Pop Culture Images Today, and a museum called the La Forêt Museum in Tokyo. And it did kind of set the stage for this movement of art that has many names. I particularly like pop surrealism, where artists are addressing, the visual culture that they're dealing with and that their own relationships with it. And that kind of just took off from there. And he's had many successful exhibitions since then, and he was able to leave his freelance practice behind at that time and move forward and become a full-time painter.
Fantastic. So I'm glad you brought up the idea of titles, because I think Todd Schorr may have the most epic titles that I've seen. So we're going to scroll through some of the works, and one of the things I was particularly interested in from a curatorial perspective were some of the themes, sort of ideas and content in Todd's work that may have resonated in your thinking about creating this exhibition, Heather.
Absolutely. What's really interesting with Todd's work is that he will take on visual motifs that you'll see again and again and again. So there are things that he works through until he literally, I call it like chewing gum that has all the flavor chewed out of it. Like he will explore a visual idea and continue to take it to its end, which, by the way, is one of the things that I think makes him great. But thematically, I think very hard about, I'm glad you brought up this one, the Hydra of Madison Avenue, because these idea of what's being fed to us in our visual culture from corporations. So you're talking about logos and cartoons, and I was mentioned, what does a little dancing peanut have to do with the food you buy for your family? And he also was highly influenced by movies. He was influenced by car culture and magazines, and a lot of these things kind of keep going and coming up. And what I really think is interesting is this isn't much than just Todd. This was an entire generation of people, and it was this the baby boomers who really experienced images and imagery created for mass reproduction, and it's had a big effect on Todd. As I mentioned to you earlier, Todd has an extraordinary visual memory, and he can tell you details of things that have happened 50 years with extreme visual details. So that's really what grabbed me. It's like it kind of going back and forth into this idea of these things that affected him. These are autobiographical, but at the same time, they can be extrapolated to like our entire generation and have a big influence on how we consume visual culture today.
Sort of thinking about Todd's vivid memory. I know we'll be playing a video for everybody. Todd at the space in Virginia, and he talks, about remembering seeing King Kong for the first time and sort of the influence of Willis O'Brien. Do you want to speak a little bit more to that, Heather, as we're looking through these works?
Todd will talk about, and by the way, I do just want to point out a little detail, since you have monster specter appeal, or specter monster appeal. You'll see in the bottom of the image a small child. There's like tiny figure. It's not something you necessarily see until you go see the works in person. But this little figure is an avatar for Todd as a child. And Ape Worship, which I know we're going to talk about later, also has a child in it. And this was really compelling to me, because Todd would talk about the movies that he would watch after school on TV. And he was talking about seeing, I think it was Mighty Joe Young. I don't think it was actually King Kong at first, but the Mighty Joe Young, I think, was the movie he saw. And it was like the same movie that was played every day for a week. So he had this opportunity to see it. And he said, like, the first time he saw it, he couldn't watch the end of it. It was so visually thrilling. And then, every day he'd go back to it and watch it again after school and watch it until it kind of cemented itself into his memory. And I think that's a really, and it never left. I mean, and he made this monumental work because of it.
You bring up the idea of memory, and truly, I know we've sort of spoken a little bit about that in terms of the approach to education. Sort of a question to both of you. Heather, could you tell us a little bit more about sort of Todd's process and the way that he works through these paintings? Does he sort of finish specific sections and then move through the painting like that, or is he like painting on throughout the image? I know we have some preliminary sketches and paintings for these larger works, but then also to you, truly, the initial question I sent over to Heather, what sort of parts of Todd Schorr's work resonated the most with you? So we'll go to Heather first and then to Trudy.
Okay. I'm glad you mentioned the sketches and the studies. Todd is the most intentional artist I've ever known. He works through his ideas pretty thoroughly before he begins a painting. And so once he begins a painting, he knows absolutely where every single paint stroke is going to be. And so he will do an underpainting and then he'll paint on top of it. But yes, he does it in sections. Absolutely. He doesn't work through the whole painting, because he knows exactly what it's supposed to look like at the end, and he's already in his head the finished painting, so he doesn't have to kind of move through and work through the paint, because that's not what his process is. That's not what he's about. He is about the goal and the finished painting.
Trudy, do you want to jump in here?
Sure. Well, if you're talking about memory and nostalgia, kind of being the things that stand out to me about his work and how we interpreted that through our education programs and materials. I think it's, Todd comes from a very specific time, place, and culture in America. Born in 1954, living in a middle class neighborhood in New Jersey for most of his childhood. So, it's fun. A lot of us can identify this imagery in his work, but even if you can't, I think kind of a universal understanding that we all have is that we all have our King Kong, right? We all have our Mighty Joe Young, or Space Invaders, or Star Wars. So we might not share the same visual imagery and influences as Todd, but I think we could all relate to having those early childhood influences stay with us through adulthood and still impact and shape our lives.
Sort of going back to you, Heather, does Todd work with assistants, or he painting this all pretty much on his own?
All on his own. Yes, he sets up he lives on both the East Coast and the West Coast. I visited him his East Coast home, and he had basically taken over his living room as a studio. And it's his wife, Kathy Schorr, is also an artist, and that's what they're about. They're about art making, so they have no problems kind of taking over their living space and having it be their studio space. But it's just Todd and Kathy.
Truly, I love that you sort of brought up this idea of the entry point into an exhibition, trying to create the commonality. We might have different perspectives on the world, but, there's some sort of moments in our lives that, have sort of general appeal. And so it brings up a question for me, like in terms of the working relationship between curatorial and education at Virginia MoCA. How closely were you working with Heather on this show? And then we can sort of jump into some installation views at the museum.
Sure. So at Virginia MoCA, we, Heather and I, work in a combined education and exhibitions department, and we are overseen by a director of exhibitions and education, Allison Byrne. So we work jointly as a team. So as the beginning ideas of artists and exhibition concepts are kind of being batted around even before any asks are made, Heather and Allison do a really great job at kind of communicating those like seeds of ideas to education, just so we're not caught off guard. So we have that early stage, we're already kind of aware of things they have their eye on. And then as things become more formalized, it's Heather's research and writing that really drives education. We might tease out the big idea and the main themes that we want to communicate through our education programs, but it's all kind of taken from Heather's kind of writing and her curatorial vision. So having that access and that working relationship of knowing what's coming and having the access to the research and the information early really helps inform the direction of education.
And Heather, when you sort of, forming the seeds of an idea for an exhibition, what is your approach to thinking about what education initiatives may be, or what sort of elements of the exhibition could be potentially interesting points to explore?
Well, that's really interesting. MoCA has a really great office culture where we're really encouraged to talk to each other off the get-go. And I'm a talker when it comes to working out ideas. So I think sometimes the educators hear what I'm thinking even when they don't want to. So I will start to I spend a lot of time thinking about an idea and what I think is relevant and important to our audiences and our community. And that's also something that's integral to MoCA. We're a very visitor-centric, visitor-focused museum. And so I really like to sound out ideas with educators, with Allison, before I move forward on them, because I need to know that they are going to resonate with our visitors and that it is something that our educators can work from. So from the very beginning, our discussion, I'm in discussion with the educators just from the get-go. And then as things start to coalesce and I start to think about my writing, I will send drafts to them and we'll have conversations about it throughout.
It's so interesting. I can't help but feel there's some parallels between your approach and sort of how it works at the Crocker too. You know, I'm thinking about Christy and sort of the conversations that we had. We had a program a couple months ago called The Personal Element, where I sat down with curators Jamie Yar and Christy Hajela to kind of talk a little bit more about their process. And I'm picking up lots of similarities in the way that we work, the sort of idea of exhibition alignment meetings, you know, what are the curators thinking about sort of thematically for shows, and where can education kind of almost amplify or further explore some of the dimensions of the exhibition. So we're looking at some installation shots now of the show at Virginia Mocha. And I thought, Heather, maybe we could start with the idea around the title of the exhibition, Atomic Cocktail.
Yeah, I call those ideas shower ideas because they come to you at strange moments. And, you know, I wanted a title that was easy to remember, that was as dynamic as his work, that really spoke about where Todd came from. And we've mentioned several times that he's a baby boomer and that he really grew up mid-century America. And I thought about that era and what that was like. And I'm like, there's so many things that went into that cocktail, and I went like, oh, there it is. And that is definitely what the title speaks to, is that, you know, growing up in this atomic era with all these different ideas and innovations that were fomenting at the time, kind of going into this big cocktail that made up Todd Schorr and his vision.
And was there a sort of a particular choice of having Spectre of Monster Appeal sort of open the exhibition?
It's iconic. It's very theatrical. You could see the entrance to the exhibition from the outside the exhibition spaces. So I was definitely wanted there to be imagery that would draw somebody in, whether they knew him or not. There's kind of this mandorla effect around the monster in the center. So it references you know, his old master approach to painting and to presenting. It just kind of did everything that a lot of his works do at once. So I thought it was just a great introductory image, like painting.
I'm very intrigued by this idea, almost like a painting or paintings within a painting in Todd's work. You know, it's like you can spend many hours sort of looking and, you know, discovering new things. I have to share an anecdote from a program that we have, ArtRx, sort of as we move through the space here, which is a program based on slow looking that we offer for people who self-identify as suffering from chronic pain. So for an hour, we look at 2 works of art in a group, you know, all about socializing and social interaction. But we did the Hydra of Madison Avenue, and it was probably one of the most robust and like excitable discussions that we've had in that program. And I know one of the ArtRx docents, whenever I pull up a Todd Schorr work, she just sort of beams from end to end, you know, in terms of her smile. So there's like a real fascination and sort of joy in seeing some of the figures and characters in Todd's work. So I don't know, Trudy, do you want to walk us through the space a little bit? And Heather, feel free to jump in too. So I assume we look at Spectre of Monster Appeal when we enter the space, and now we're kind of starting to move through it, getting a little deeper into the show.
Sure. I mean, I'd rather, Heather, can you kind of take us through, since you designed the layout?
Yeah.
So
this room is the last part that you're in before you leave the exhibition. It was Monster of Spectre Appeal, and then I'm trying to remember the large Apocalypse painting of 4 Horsemen Apocalypse painting was directly to your right, and then it was Houghton. You're gonna have to show me. That was all the way in the back. Okay. And so, like, let me just, okay, yeah. So the Parade of the Damned was on your right, and then you saw the Four Horsemen painting, and then I believe it was the Spectre of Monster, no, the Hydra of Madison Avenue, and another large piece. I was really interested in pairing this avatar, this little boy. You know, you mentioned the themes. I didn't go chronologically. I went thematically with this exhibition because, like I said, the work, Todd's works speak to each other throughout time. Like, you're not going to have a painting that can't speak to a painting he makes 10 years from now. His evolution is very clear, and that dialogue is present. And I was really interested in the beginning paintings that had, the first few paintings were a little more macabre, a little darker, and then you moved into paintings that kind of used the small boy as the avatar, kind of informing what Todd saw as a child and how they manifested later in his painting. And then towards the end, it was, you could see some of his newer work. I could detect a very definite change in his palette. His color palette lightened up. I felt like there was more Rococo influences kind of coming into his painting, and I wanted those within relative eyesight of each other so that dialogue could happen. And then at the end, there were a couple of paintings. It was we saw one already, which was the science fiction painting with the Vulcan, yes, and to the on the other side of it was the painting that, the one under the gun. I tend to forget my pronouns. The painting that had all the, like, what do you call them? The little monsters that were the little plastic figure models that were so prevalent at the time.
Oh, the weirdos and the rat
Yeah.
fink, the big
Yeah.
Roth, the
Right.
head Big Daddy Roth.
And I felt like that car culture and that science fiction culture was reflective more of an older Todd Schorr. And so I kind of, it was a little slightly more adult content. And so I kind of wanted those together as well. And so it was very loosely done. And I'm also going to give people a little peek behind the curtain as well. As a curator, and Christy, I'm sure would back me up if she were here, you also are dealing with the architecture you have. Yeah. When you're building, every building has quirks. Every building has things where it's just easier and more appropriate to hang certain types of work. And Todd's work is very large. He makes smaller work paintings, but his most iconic works are quite large. And by the way, that was a lot of my decision making for what we brought in as well. I'm not going to be able to bring in a Todd Schorr exhibition every other year. So I knew that this was going to be an opportunity that wasn't going to come easily again. So I wanted to bring in as many of his iconic works as possible, because he has an enormous fan base of people who have only seen his work on a screen. And I wanted that opportunity for them to see the work in person. So I had many monumentally scaled works to place in a space that, again, everybody's museum is a little quirky. So I had to consider that very carefully.
So you bring up the idea of scale, and we have a sort of a question in from the audience in terms of studio size for Todd. I know you mentioned before we started that you spent some time with him in the studio, getting to look at his work. Do you want to speak a little bit about his sort of studio and his studio practice?
Sure. He has large easels, and he, from what I saw at the time, he was working on one large piece at a time, because that's his studio's in his living room. They converted his living room to a studio space. And a large painting like these can fit into a living room, but that is going to be the only thing in the living room. And that is what his situation, and he's perfectly happy living and working that way. It's his life. So yeah, that's basically it. And I said, and he'll have his study up, and he'll have his basically his recipe for the way that the painting's gonna be up and ready to refer to. And he has an idea when he wakes up every morning. He has an idea what he wants to accomplish, and he accomplishes that. He is the most disciplined artist.
I want to go back to Ape Worship, and on the left-hand side, you can sort of see those preliminary sketches and drawings
Yeah.
in connection. Last question for you, Heather, in the space before I go over to Truly, but at the Crocker, Ape Worship sort of is your introduction to the exhibition. It's this massive painting in the second floor breezeway that really grabs the attention and piques one's interest for what lies inside Gallery 240. What was your thinking about the role of Ape Worship in this installation?
Again, Ape Worship is a privately owned painting. It doesn't come out to museums very often, or for exhibition at all very often. And I knew that a lot of our visitors were going to come to see this work. And so you can kind of get glimpses of it throughout the entire exhibition, but I wanted, I admitted I wanted our visitors to work for it a little bit. I wanted them to see some of the other things he'd done and really understand his process. Also, there is a theatricality to this piece. It is not just the painting, it is this amazing, you can see this amazing frame around it that he worked with a set designer in Los Angeles to do our props, somebody who does props for movies. And so Todd was instrumental in the design of the frame as well. And so they were, and this painting is just huge, and it's heavy, and it has a sense of theater. So I have a space in my museum that I often think of the space where theater takes place, where it feels like that very theatrical moment. And I knew, like, in my heart, that this was the place for this painting.
And if I have my facts correct, it weighs about 800 pounds and is fiberglass.
Yes. Bondo, like the Bondo stuff, that moldable. Yes, I mentioned to you earlier, all contemporary art is large, heavy, and extraordinarily fragile, and this is no exception.
Truly, Heather, sort of, I'm going to read a little blurb from the introductory text because I feel like it sums up nicely what Heather was talking about. So Atomic Cocktail takes a closer look at the connection between the synthesis of visual culture from the artist's childhood and his current pictorial language. Do you feel like some of that curatorial philosophy or curatorial interest filtered down into your sort of education initiatives connected to the exhibition?
Yeah, for sure. That curatorial vision kind of fuels education in our programs and initiatives. And I think one thing Heather was kind of talking about a little earlier is like, she identified different kind of groupings of Todd's work, like looking at the body of work that's in the show as a whole, and then kind of identifying groupings. Yeah, the way they're in the exhibition, they're grouped by kind of like a tone and a certain feel. But I think something that we've learned through Heather's writing and talking to her is, you know, there's kind of the themes of, there's pop culture, there's also those self-portraits that she talked about, and we kind of framed them as alternative self-portraits through some programming opportunities, letting people reflect on objects and place that are a representation of them rather than a traditional portrait, as well as that social commentary. Those are really important influences in our programming.
I also have to ask, as we move on to the installation at the Crocker, seeing the video of Todd in the space and everybody around him, it almost feels like a luxury to have, you know, had people in the space. Did you do a lot of touring of the exhibition, or was, you know, sort of taking people through the space? How important was that to your programming?
Sure. So we see, thousands and thousands of school students, and this exhibition, I believe, was in the fall of 2018, so which is one of our busiest time for tours. That was a huge undertaking, is kind of creating the tour framework and the training to to dig at those themes that we just talked about and to communicate those to students and have them make their own personal connections. So we have a huge school tour program, and a lucky bunch of students from all around Hampton Roads got to experience that museum. And we did a few different gallery talks. Heather did an amazing one with Avi Santo, who was a professor at ODU, kind of exploring pop culture. That was his specialty is communications, TV, media, pop culture. So Heather and Avi were kind of decoding some of Todd's pieces. I also planned a gallery talk with a local artist, Jeff Tarkenton, who's a real kind of comic book nerd, graphic novels, comic books, but also kind of that like has an appreciation for the vintage things as well. So through those gallery talks, we were hoping to kind of decode some of Todd's imagery for the public. And early on, we even had some education staff where they spent some hours like literally decoding, like doing a lot of like Google image reverse searches and kind of mapping out all the different visual pop culture references that Todd is making, because that's what people want to know, you know. Yes, we can leave visitors and students the space to interpret the work for themselves, but he is really pulling from real world things, and people want to know what those things are. So we spent some time doing that as well.
As we're talking about books, it's a sort of an appropriate time to transition over to the Crocker installation and sort of how the collaboration between Virginia Mocha and the Crocker came to be. So I don't know if you both want to speak a little bit to that. I absolutely love this image. I wasn't at the museum yet for Hi-Fructose. So when I see this particular photograph, big shout out to Brian Sir in the Crocker marketing department. It's an absolutely wonderful image. But do you two want to chat a little bit about how Hi-Fructose came to be at the Crocker from Virginia Mocha?
Sure. We began building that exhibition. So don't ask me too many questions. I think in 2014. We had started a relationship with Annie and Daniel Seifert, who are the founders and editors of Hi-Fructose magazine. And we were talking about doing this exhibition with them. And it for us seemed to be a really important moment, and to address this pop surrealism. I believe they call it new contemporary art. This movement of art that really we did not feel had gained the recognition that it deserved in the scholarly canon of art. And so we brought together 50 artists. They had done 10 years of the magazine. We made a selection of 50 artists that they had worked with that had been featured in the magazine that we felt would make a great representation of the magazine. The artwork we included, some of which had been featured in the magazine, but for the most part, they were just representative works of the artist. We just wanted everybody to understand the artists and the artworks that were being brought in. And this that you're showing right now is the last polar expedition of Commander Perry, which was Todd Schorr's work in that exhibition. And I knew about Todd Schorr's work. I didn't know the extent of Todd Schorr's work. And in fact, I placed this piece exactly where I put the Ape Worship piece later for Todd's exhibition. And it was incredible. I got the opportunity to teach a little bit and give several tours of the Hi-Fructose exhibition. And it was just remarkable to see the reaction of people to this work. And not only that, but I actually had a moment where I was teaching a group of middle school boys. I remember maybe 20 of them, and their enthusiasm, and they were sharing this narrative. They were creating these stories for me from this piece, and it was amazing. And then I remember looking at them and being like, okay, these stories are great. So like, what happens if you take it to the next level and consider these things that you're seeing a metaphor? And I literally watched light bulbs go off above the heads of these children. And to have this, like, it was almost a magical moment for me. It was just this idea where you really understood that kids were really understanding visual language and that they were making progress in it. And it was, I don't know if they could have done it through another painting. And so it really struck me how important Todd's work was, in that he does create this visual lexicon that's accessible and yet sophisticated and yet can take people to the next level in understanding art, and the language of art. And so when he had a book called Neverlasting Miracles come out in, I believe it was 2017, we knew that we wanted to create this exhibition, Atomic Cocktail, to accompany that.
And truly, was there sort of any collaboration between the education departments at the two museums around Hi-Fructose?
Sure. So after, I guess when we were shopping it around and contacting museums that we thought would be interested in the show, all the education material that we created for Hi-Fructose, for the Hi-Fructose exhibition, which includes the audio guide, a close looking guide, a family guide, also our gallery teacher resource packet, as well as our programming descriptions and our interpretive gallery material. That was all made available to the Crocker. And actually in 2018, I presented with Stacy Shelnut Hendrick, which is the Director of Education at the Crocker, alongside Allison Kaplan, who was the Director of Education at the Akron Museum of Art, which I believe was the third stop for the exhibition. And we all presented on, basically having the same traveling exhibition and how each museum uniquely presented the works as well as interpreted it for education. So that was a really enlightening experience because I had no direct communication with education. It was until after the fact that I reached out to Stacy and Allison to see if they would be interested in presenting. So I believe as far as Hi-Fructose, it was our Director of Exhibitions Education communicated with the curators at each museum. So it was just a good way to come together after the fact and see what each other has done and also kind of learn some lessons as how we can kind of better communicate and learn from each other in the future, especially when it comes to traveling exhibitions, so we don't have to, reinvent the wheel every time.
Those the education interpretives that you sent over are amazingly extensive. It took me some time to glean through all of them over the last 3 or 4 weeks. But sort of the idea of shopping a traveling show around is a reminder that a traveling exhibition is, in a sense, a product, right?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose, Heather, this is a question for you. I know Christy had a little room to kind of reimagine the show for the Crocker. And one of the biggest differences I noticed is sort of the overly moodiness of the Crocker installation, much darker, much more heavily reliant on spotlighting versus sort of a much brighter and airier space at Virginia Mocha. You talk a little bit more about, what are the sort of restrictions or, the wiggle room that, various hosting institutions may have from someone who puts or creates the initial exhibition.
For sure. Unless an artist absolutely specifies, one of the big things is color. If you're going to color the walls, and because color can set a mood and a tone, and lighting is a really good way to reset a mood or a tone. Now, we wrote the labels and we absolutely liked our labels, but you have to if you're shopping out this product, you do have to understand that things need to be reinterpreted for the audiences that they're going to be part of. And nobody understands that better than the museum staff in the place where the exhibition is going to be. So if they come back and they say, hey, we want to rewrite this or we want to redo it, I get to see that. I can say, you have so drifted far from the intention of this exhibition, it doesn't make sense. but you know, for the most part, we're colleagues, we're professionals, we respect each other, and so often there is a little wiggle room, but mostly it's done in service of the museum that the place is the exhibitions are going to be. So yeah, so there is, like I said, you can definitely set a different tone, and Christy definitely set a more dramatic tone. I feel like she's referencing so many things with this dramatic lighting and the darker walls. I think of altarpieces, and I think about sublime landscape painting of the 18th and the 19th centuries, where, like, again, so you get this sense of theater very much through the use of lighting and color that the choices Christy made. I was using architecture more for that. You know, I felt like I also had that sense of theater, but I was able to, I have movable walls, and I was able to kind of create a walking space that created that same theater. So I think she and I had some of the same goals, but we were using different things to do that.
We see a nice image of Todd here on the right too.
Yeah.
One of the things I did want to ask you too, Heather, because we are sort of in the process of returning a traveling Granville Redmond exhibition. And what does the process look like when an exhibition comes down at a visiting museum or a museum where it's visiting? What does that process look like when you receive everything back and then sort of send it back out to collectors and loanees?
Honestly, we're not a collecting institution, so we're never sending out our own artwork. So the artwork is not going to come back to Virginia. Many of the collectors are actually already on the West Coast, so it wouldn't make sense even to send it back here and then just send it back across the country. So we will work with several shippers, and it is, fortunately, that's not my job. To have to do the logistics of that, but they are very detailed, and they have to get back in touch with everybody who owns the work, arrange a time and location, because sometimes, especially in the space of years when a show is traveling, the collectors will move, and the place or where they want the artwork to be will also change, or maybe and this has happened, actually this happened with this exhibition. One of the collectors passed away unexpectedly, and so ownership of some of the work changed, and so all that has to be renegotiated about where the work is going and how it's going to be distributed. It is extraordinarily detailed and complicated, and fortunately you guys have great registrars, from what I understand, really great registrars who understand this process and work with our people and kind of sort out those logistics of what's going out with what shipment in what direction.
Erin, Natalia, if you're listening, that's a big shout out from Heather. I want to be cognizant of time because we're running out. I feel like I can keep talking forever. So I sort of breeze through some of these installation images of Ape Worship. It sort of gives one a sense of the scale and the complexity of getting it installed. And then that's sort of a reminder of what it looks like in the space. And then this is what it looks like in the Crocker. So you can see it sort of, if you're coming up the stairs at the end of the breezeway onto the second floor, it's the first thing you see before you enter the 240 galleries over there on the left-hand side. And I asked for a quote from our exhibition designer and senior preparator, Matt Isbell, about putting Ape Worship up on the wall. And I have to read sort of my favorite line from the quote. It required a delicate and coordinated dance of 6 of us, not to mention a whole host of wheels, rigging, and protective materials. Who said working in an art museum wasn't fun or interesting, right?
Oh, for sure.
And Matt sent over these images too, sort of his preliminary model for the layout that I'm sure him and Kristen would have spoken at length about. We're going to put a link in the chat now to that conversation with Christy and Jamie Yard, sort of, those of you who are watching get a better sense of how exhibitions come together at the Crocker. And I always find it fascinating to look at these preliminary models because you see how the artworks move around. You know, so there's Spectre of Monster Appeal, which, if I have my geography right, is now over here in the actual exhibition. And you can see an image for the sculpture in the back there too. So sort of a lot of layout, editing, that sort of stuff, Heather, when putting together an exhibition.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Um, I make a proposal for a layout, and I think it must go at least through 3 iterations minimum. And again, that's where we start having conversations with educators, because one of the big things you have to ask is, can you bring a tour group through? You know, you also have to ask your security team, you know, can this work be protected in this way? You know, so there's many people and many who have an input on this, who have a concern regarding the work.
I love that we're talking about exhibitions and we move on to education, because truly I have to say this art lab feels like an exhibition in and of itself. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you want to sort of chat a little bit about your thinking and some of the interactives you've created for Todd Schorr.
Sure. So Art Lab, it is an exhibition. It's our interactive gallery space where we explore all those kind of the main themes and the big ideas of our main gallery, which the Todd Schorr exhibition was in our main gallery space, and we kind of tease those ideas out through hands-on, low-tech interactives to really kind of hammer those things home to the visitor. Also kind of gives a respite from the museum. You know, we're a small, mid-sized museum, but museum fatigue is real. And Art Lab is in a space where you can touch and do and make and have a seat, and just kind of a different vibe of the rest of the museum. You can move forward. So several of our interactives in Art Lab were inspired by Todd Schorr. This one was in our kind of response area, where we asked visitors to write or draw in response to a early childhood influence that still affects them today, kind of going back to that idea that we talked about at the beginning about how Todd's influences are his and many of them are recognizable, but everyone has their own. So allowing visitors to have a voice within the museum, sharing things about their culture, their childhood, and their upbringing. So it was really great to see what people left behind. This was one of my favorite interactives in Art Lab. We also talked about education and exhibitions collaborating, and one thing that I do appreciate from Heather is at the beginning stages, when Heather's talking to artists about the exhibition, education's also kind of brought up early in that discussion. And I think it was Heather who suggested Todd lent us, if you go ahead, just go on one. No, but I'll go ahead and talk about those. So these weren't lent to us by Todd. These are 1950s replicas of robot toys. And I just happened to have a friend who had a massive vintage retro robot toy collection. And we looked through the collection together, and I don't know how, but we found several robot toys from his collection that were in Vern to Vader. So that was really fun. And, you know, giving that like tangible connection, like this was a thing, this was a toy, this was in someone's real life, and then connecting it directly to the work of art. So visitors would have seen Vern to Vader, then they would have walked into the Art Lab gallery space, and then making those connections was really exciting.
Truly, we got a question in the from the audience. Sort of Todd Schorr's work, the ideal to prove practice VTS touring as a gold standard.
Sure. Yeah. What's happening here? And what do you see that makes you say that? For sure, there's so much happening. And like Heather says, when she was mentioning her middle school tour and how all those students were basically developing stories from their work, it really opens it up. And then I think by adding another layer of asking students then to kind of analyze and interpret from their initial observations, we had some really, really powerful discussions with students and adults, Todd's work. Also thinking about, if you could go back one more, sorry. Just one more forward. Sorry, there we go. So actually we're looking at two boxes there on the right-hand side, the weirdo caricatures and the Ed Roth Mother's Worry drag race monster. Those are actually belong to Todd. And so that was something that Heather was aware of, that Todd had this collection of stuff that informed his paintings. And I think that kind of spurred the idea to collect and display those real life tangible objects that informed his work. So it was really great to, from that strong relationship that Heather formed with Todd, letting us know that those are things that he has and probably would like release to us. That was really exciting to be able to have those in the Art Lab gallery space.
So Heather, it sounds like Todd was like fairly intensely involved in sort of planning discussions and sort of the development of the show. Was that
Absolutely. Well, you know, Todd was extremely generous with his time with me, for sure. And when you're working in contemporary art, having access to the artist is probably one of the best parts of the job. And so, yes, so I would call him often and we would have these long talks about what we were bringing in and why, and how he felt about things. And because I really wanted to honor his own vision of his work, and to understand, have that understanding. And, you know, I do believe his work is going to be an important part of art history canon, and to, as a scholar, to be able to document and to spend that time with him so that in the future, what we've done now can be a resource for scholars, was really important to me. And access to Todd was a big part of that.
So on this slide here is just a selection of images from different public programs that we did. Todd's work, like we've been saying, is really accessible, like a really great entry point at looking and spending time with the work of art. I also think his humor is a great disarmer for people. And so we have just selections from some teen, adult, and family programs where we did some gallery activities, using objects, encouraging people to make the most random, bizarrest connections between an everyday object and a work of art, really kind of digging into that personal connection piece. Also, for a teen program, we highlighted the comic book aspect. We had a teen takeover night, a big free event for teens where they just kind of take over the museum space planned by teens. We also had a surreal cereal bar, where we had like pickles and Fruit Loops and chocolate sauce. So kind of surreal cereal bar. We also did a deviled egg scavenger hunt. There's basically like a deviled egg piece by Todd. The name escapes me right now. And it also happened to be National Deviled Egg Day. So we took like plastic black eggs and hid them around the museum with various tricks and treats. So just kind of another way to get those teens spending more time looking and thinking about Todd's work.
I know Stacy was thinking a lot about comic books too. Books connected to one's childhood. Yeah.
And I think that comic books and kind of the visual culture, I think that's what really spurred the idea for this partnership. So we partnered with a local independent cinema house, where they, once a month they show kind of like an old film, and have a nonprofit organization sponsor it. So we were inspired by the work of Todd to pick themes that kind of spoke to his work in some way. The Monster Squad is a wild 1980s kind of Goonies style film. A lot of imagery connected to the monster of Spectre Appeal, or maybe I got that vice versa, as well as the Hydra piece that you see in the middle slide here. We also thought Roger Rabbit was a really great connection, thinking about his his influence of animation. So that was just a way for us to take Todd's work into the community. We went to a different city with this program, helped with the visibility, and just encourage people to come see the work in real life through making these connections to these classic films.
It feel good to be able to watch a movie in the company of others.
Yeah, when was the last time?
And then, yeah, I sort of asked Stacey for a question around her thinkings for education connected to Todd. It's also, collective nostalgia and memory. Even though Todd has a certain perspective, thinking about what our our own individual iconic moments and aesthetics in our upbringings, and how that may create the entry point, which is kind of what we discussed at the beginning of the program. Ways to make exhibitions accessible through curating and through education. So I've sort of peppered in the questions from the audience as we've moved along. So, looking at the time, I think we're 10 minutes over now. So I do want to say a big thank you to you, Heather and Truly, for taking the time to join us today. It was nice to travel a little bit, coast to coast, and to get an inside look at how things operate at Virginia MoCA. So thank you for making the time. I really appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Cool.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.
It was lovely.
Bye. So thank you everybody for watching. Just a few program plugs. Upcoming programs in January, we have the official Rogue Book Club with Director of Education, Stacey Shelnut-Hendrick. So make sure to sign up for that. And then we also have a brand new program, a series of programs coming up called Museums and Equity. It's a really important set of programs. Please make sure to check that out. We'll have the link to the calendar page in the chat. I want to thank you all for joining us here today, and we're going to play out with a video of Todd Schorr at Virginia MoCA. I hope you enjoy it and have a great rest of the afternoon. Bye.
My parents were members of a gallery of modern art. So at a very early age, I was exposed to that, and it really kind of had a very strong impact. And the other big early influence would have been seeing the film King Kong, the old black and white film. Seeing that King Kong movie when I was 4 or 5 was the first time I was able to really believe in a fantasy world. I mean, it really took me in, and it was the first work of believable fantasy that I encountered. And it was just the atmosphere, especially the jungle scenes, these dreamy, kind of hazy, misty scenes that really permeated my dreams for years and years as a kid. So when I got to college, there was nothing in the gallery scene that was like a combination of cartooning and surrealism. I was kind of steered into the illustration program, and for about 10 years I had a successful career in illustration. I did Time magazine covers and a lot of album covers, and then in '92 I had my first one-person show. It did really well, and it gave me the confidence to completely sever all ties with commercial art. And from that point on, I just painted for myself. Sometimes I'll get an idea and it's almost fully formed, and I can just work that up into a detailed drawing. But most often, a lot of my ideas, I'll get like a kind of a notion of something, like an interesting thought. It's not just a decorative, interesting image. It's got to have something behind it, just something. My idea was to do a painting that when you stand in front of it, you could feel like you could walk into it. You become immersed in it, And also the scale, it's around you. It's kind of like, it takes you into it a little bit more than when you're working on a smaller easel painting. There is a little boy in each painting that's at the center of it, and that's supposed to be me. It's kind of, this is the world that, influenced me as a kid. Things change every 5 minutes. There's always some new fashion and some new trend, and people will jump on that bandwagon. You gotta be careful of that. And if you really love what you do, and it's an important aspect of your life, you'll keep doing it. And I feel that anyone who really believes in themselves and isn't deluding themselves by thinking they're better than they really are, and they're humble about it, I think you'll succeed.